Welcome to LEED in Climate Change. I'm Liz Beardsley, Senior Policy Counsel at the U.S. Green Building Council. We're really excited that you're here today. LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It means many things to many people. From our inbox, it's too easy or too hard. We know that for many of you here, the connection between LEED and dealing with climate change is critical, and we share that concern. So we're really happy to have this session today to dig into ways that we're starting to think about that and start and continue a dialogue with you, our community. Okay, it's an intermediate session, and we have learning objectives. Primarily, we'd like you to understand how the building sector fits into our global climate goals and how we're doing. We want you to understand some of the key ways that LEED currently addresses climate change and how we're looking to evolve that to be more impactful, and how there may be some additional opportunities in the future. We have a great group of experts to talk to this issue today. Brendan Owens is Senior Vice President at U.S. Green Building Council, and among many other things, he helped lead the effort to develop the impact goals for LEED v4, of which climate change is dominant, and is also very involved with building grid interaction. We have Ted Tiffany from Gutman and Blavaway Engineers. Among other things, he's the lead sustainability practice at that firm, is very involved with zero net energy buildings, and is on the LEED Energy and Atmosphere Technical Advisory Group. We're pleased to have Lynn Simon here today, Senior Vice President at Thornton Tomasetti. And through her architecture practice, she's been a leader in green building throughout her career and has won numerous awards. Lynn is both an AIA Fellow and a LEED Fellow. And she's contributed to the LEED system, serving on various committees over her career. And we have Ben Myers, an engineer and head of sustainability at Boston Properties. He's led Boston Properties to be a top 5% global GRESB score, and has dealt with sustainability and resource efficiency and renewable energy from both a for-profit and nonprofit owner perspective. So welcome to all of you. And we hope you will be participating as well. So LEED was born with one goal: to transform the environment, the built environment, to one that is sustainable and can support the earth and human occupants. We've made progress through this system, and we've had an impact. Now, 25 years in, we have over 44,000 certified buildings and over 600 million square feet. We're affecting construction to some degree in over 160 countries around the globe. And as our understanding of the impact of buildings on the environment has evolved, so has the system. With LEED v4, we stepped back and looked to align the system with specific goals and outcomes. And one of the priorities here was climate change. So 35% of the points in v4 contribute to the reduction of buildings' contribution to climate change. We're going to focus on energy in the next hour, but across all of our impact categories is helping with the climate change, including water. So by reducing your water use, you're also reducing the carbon associated with pumping and treating that water. By reducing waste, construction demolition debris, operational waste, food waste, all of these things are ways that using the LEED system and implementing these strategies can help with that outcome. But here we are, 25 years later, and we know much more needs to be done in the sector. Earlier this fall, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a special report. They took the step in light of dire predictions of where we're heading on the planet. The IPCC report looked at how we are heading towards 1.5 degree scenario. and for the building sector, identified this pathway to be consistent with that outcome. All building emissions must be reduced by 80 to 90% by 2050. New construction must be fossil-free and near-zero energy by 2020, just a few years from now. And we need to increase the rate of energy rehabilitation to 5% in developed countries. These are it's a dire warning coming from the IPCC, and it's a call to action that we must answer. Here's what we know about where the sector is right now. So from the International Energy Agency, the data shows that building emissions globally appear to have peaked a few years ago. However, it's not coming down at the rate that we need it to. And the reason why is as we're seeing increases in energy efficiency and intensity, that's helping by coming down about 1.5% a year. But that's offset by the huge amount of new construction, which has been growing at the rate of about 2.8% a year since 2000. That growth in floor area globally is wiping out the efficiency gains that we're making. And this also has implications for embodied carbon with a construction process, both in materials and construction activity. So this chart shows that the yellow bars are that carbon that's associated with the construction process and materials for new construction for all the buildings projected after 2020. And then the blue bars are showing the operational energy as these new buildings come online. So that's cumulative and increases over time. But you can see in the near term, in this next 20 or 30 years that we have to make a big difference, for that new construction that's occurring, especially in the developing countries, we do need to address the embodied carbon from the construction phase. So that's where we are. We need a lot of tools to make the change that's called for. We need policy, we need building code, we need finance, we need commitments, we need net zero. But for the next hour, we want to dive into LEED. And how does this one tool, how can we leverage this tool to optimize its impact on this critical social problem that we're facing? So let's dive right in.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Thanks, Ted.
So the first challenge that we needed to do in LEED was to talk about the metrics that we use. The energy cost metric in ASHRAE 90.1, the underlying standards, and frankly other standards that relate to LEED, has traditionally been on the energy cost metric. How many people think the energy cost metric is a very important metric? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you cite energy as an important metric for buildings, EUI? How many think source energy is the most important metric? Okay. How about greenhouse gas emissions is the most important metric? How many of you think all of these are important metrics? Okay, so the challenge is we've been asked a lot, make a greenhouse gas emissions metric that's meaningful. And the TAG took that in and we started to talk about, okay, what does a greenhouse gas emission metric look like? What happens in 10 years when we've done all our jobs and we completely decarbonize the electric sector to zero emissions? Does that still measure a building's performance in 10 years when we've done all our jobs? And the answer is maybe no. And then we lose efficiency when we've got a zero in the greenhouse gas emission column. So that starts to challenge our metrics, and then maybe we start to talk about a dynamic greenhouse gas emissions. And we'll talk about that a little bit later about how policy making at the corporate level and the state and regional level are starting to look at dynamic greenhouse gas emissions. So what we're thinking about now is multiple metrics. How many of you have actually looked at the Alternative Compliance Path 95 and used it on a project? One. Yeah, thank you.
Just if you get on the stick here.
How many of you didn't know that was available or what it is? Okay, so the ACP 95 was a brilliant move. in the fact that you can now apply a building's energy performance and measure it on the different metrics: primary energy, site energy, source energy, greenhouse gas emissions, and then cost. And then you can take the average of the highest two to measure your LEED point score. So when we started to look at these multiple metrics and the average of these metrics, it started to be more meaningful when we're getting into regional discussions about really cheap hydropower in the Northwest that is very low cost versus the very low cost, high carbon intensity in, say, Arkansas, which is coal-fired power. So that cost metric is equalizing those two buildings in those very different, dirty sectors. But the greenhouse gas emission qualifier really treats those different and rewards a carbon reduction in the Arkansas climate. So when we start to measure that, this is one project I did an experiment with in Tokyo. And these are all the same building model, the end results in the different applications. So it shows you how different those metrics are. Anyways, I'll let that go, but it gives you a kind of an idea of how different these metrics can be and how powerful maybe using multiple metrics are. So that's what we started to do. In LEED 4.1 language right now, we're measuring a greenhouse gas emission application and the traditional energy cost metric. Because, Ben, you still care about energy cost? Yeah. You like my button that says all about the rates. What does that mean? It means reducing my electric cost? Okay, so that's still a very important metric. So we're going to blend those metrics and start to average those out. And when we release the documentation, you'll see the point tables that are really trying to equalize that playing field for both carbon and energy costs now. There you go. So we're advancing the standard to the 90.1 2016 application, and there's improvements in that standard as well, in the performance rating method that we can talk about. So we're going to split that greenhouse gas and emission based on the same single model.
So I wanted to go over to Ben and see, I know you've used LEED and have done deep energy retrofits and new construction for a number of years, and I think more recently you've made some climate commitments and you're looking more at carbon as a metric. So how do those fit together?
Yeah, so what's really interesting to me is I've been working in real estate sustainability for about 10 years, and 10 years ago to talk about climate change in certain boardroom settings was taboo. It wasn't a subject that executives wanted to be very public with. We certainly wouldn't sit on stage and talk about climate change like we get to here today. And recently, there's been a complete shift, and I think we acknowledge this is one of the major issues of the day. You know, it's what attracts me and gives me purpose in my work at Boston Properties, and I think is now causing the organization to be more purposeful. We adopted company-wide greenhouse gas reduction targets, setting a 45% intensity reduction below a 2008 base year, and we're going to hit that early, it looks like. Ahead of the 2025 deadline. We already have 38% reduction to date. And a lot of that has been from energy efficiency in existing buildings. Mm-hmm. When you look at, we did a probabilistic model of how we could, at the asset level, influence energy efficiency over time. You see a flattening of opportunity on the energy efficiency side and a leveling of our 40 million square feet of actively managed office buildings at around an EUI of 64. Some of you in the room might be like, 64, that's way too high. But remember, we're in Boston, New York, where we have higher intensities, operating hours through the weekends. In San Francisco, that'd be a very high EUI. So as we grow in San Francisco and deliver buildings like Salesforce Tower, LEED Platinum with an EUI of 28.
That's what we want to hear.
Definitely helps us. It helps us reduce our overall. But coming back to carbon and climate change, it's always been very abstract, right? What is a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent? Mm-hmm. What is the 200,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide we emit every year mean to the boardroom, right? How do we quantify the value of that carbon? And I think having LEED as a driver to help us make decision processes and value, as we have valued high-performing LEED buildings, this issue of carbon will really help us put a value on GHG reductions beyond our 45% reduction goal, looking towards carbon neutrality, which is something we're studying today. So it's a very exciting time for me. It's also a very uneasy time with the IPCC report. I think there's a lot of work that we have to do, and it's kind of a smack in the face to see how quickly it needs to happen. But what I'm hopeful is groups like this are really motivated by that report to go further, and I know that we are as a company. So
one of the issues that we were facing is the changing grid. So that's going to be great long term, but there's some complexities here. It's not all that as easy. So we need to modify the way our buildings are related to the grid and take advantage of the strength and the resource in both. I wonder if you could talk us through that, Ted.
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about our regional grid in California. We've got a problem with solar now. Talked about this in the last session of being able to curtail or sell off our power to Arizona and Nevada at a loss. And we want to be able to utilize that solar. And when you're talking about a carbon metric on the dynamic level, the time of purchase of grid energy is really impacting the carbon signature of what we're buying off the grid. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the time of use in California and other grid structures in Texas are now being impacted so heavily by renewables, wind in Texas and solar in California, that we need to be able to utilize our building structures as either battery thermal or self-utilization strategies for solar or wind, and be able to have our buildings evolve with the grid. So it is a very regional aspect, but I think we can, as a design community, start to design better buildings that have grid harmonization or grid evolution, I call it, in mind in our design. So,
pull up the slide.
Hey, we have a slide for that. So we can go. There's a couple of corporate policies, and Google has an interesting corporate policy right now for their data center applications. And the URL's here, but you can access this report, and it's a really great read. It's only about 20, 25 pages, but buying power for Google now is done on a 24/7 basis. So they're buying renewable power for their data centers on an hour-by-hour basis, and that changes the energy profile. And if you look on it on a net basis like this is every hour of the year. On a net basis, you may say, yeah, net carbon, I'm neutral. But when you look into different power structures, and this is a data center in Iowa, the time of purchase, everything in green is essentially carbon-free, and everything going into the gray and black is carbon-intensive. So when you're working on a net basis, a lot easier. When you're working on an hourly basis of renewable power, it really impacts your buying policies and even your on-site or behind-the-meter renewable energy applications. Moving that same data center with the same power density over to North Carolina, the buying signature on the grid is really starting to evolve for that grid signature. And this changes to Nevada, where solar's prevalent, the Pacific Northwest, where hydro's prevalent, and even into China and Japan, where the energy signatures are very different and more coal and fossil fuel based. So I hand this over to
Yeah, so the intersection of the type of thinking that's being done on an hourly basis and what that means from a project planning perspective and the types of signals that we want to put into the LEED rating system to reward projects for taking steps that optimize around this GHG outcome starts to get blurry when you look at the way that greenhouse gas is not, the climate doesn't care where the greenhouse gas is coming from. The forcing is the forcing. And whether it's coming from direct on-site combustion at a building scale or whether it's coming from combustion at a grid scale for power generation, the line is blurry for us now. And that gives us some opportunities. So Ted mentioned that we're moving to a greenhouse gas metric for the optimized energy performance credit. And the thing that this enables us to do, the establishment of this energy metric, is to start to play around with the scale at which LEED recognizes leadership and strategies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions from projects. And what I mean by that is buildings are interconnected with the grid, and they are becoming more transactive with it. So we need to necessarily broaden our view of what we are encouraging project teams to do in order to account for this and really get the right set of reward and incentives pulled into the rating system. So what that means from a renewable energy perspective, everybody remembers the previous versions of LEED where on-site was one set of credits, green power was another set of credits. We're smashing those two things together because in reality, that line was artificial from the jump because if we're putting energy back on the grid, it's a transactive process. And this gives us a mechanism to be able to say, all right, we care about renewable carbon-free energy and we care about greenhouse gas emissions. And that currency, that metric that's based in GHG lets us blend those two things together so that when you're looking at the way renewable power procurement, whether it's on-site, a PPA, a green tariff, a REC, interact with the things that you're doing to reduce the amount of GHG emissions through energy conservation, through demand response, through storage, whether it's thermal or battery, thermal or electricity. We're allowed to pull those things together now. So the investments that project teams are making in renewable energies are going to count towards the GHG reductions in the optimized energy performance credit. So this blending together is really a much more rational approach to what is an interconnected system. This energy, this artificial buildings, we are our own islands on the grid. That probably hasn't been true in 40 years, but it's so much less true than it was even 5 years ago. And the rate at which that is becoming less true is accelerating. So the other thing that we're doing is trying to promote the establishment of distributed energy resources that account for the variation in the way that the power coming to our building is being generated. So Ted mentioned the fact that we see these curves that sort of look at the way that the wind profile, the wind generation profile means one set of responses from a building, and the solar generating profile of a generation asset on the grid mandates a different set. What we're trying to do with this set of credits, this grid harmonization credits, this is the old demand response credit, but we're broadening this and bringing a lot more context to the way that we want buildings to align themselves. And what I mean by that is we are looking at the things that we know make buildings good citizens on the grid, and we are asking project teams to invest in those strategies. So again, all of those distributed energy resources that I already went through are going to be things that we are rewarding project teams for engaging around, which is a really cool, really interesting set of challenges to optimize around. Now, the thing that gets really fun is that how you deploy those same sets of strategies, which are pretty much consistent nationally and internationally based on the data that we've seen so far, all of the capabilities that we want are pretty uniform. Right? So that's a great thing. There's a lot of consistency to the way that we get to talk about the deployment of DER in buildings. But the way we want you to deploy that and implement that is really dependent on where you are. So we're bringing in metrics, hourly grid, marginal grid emissions factors from programs like AVERT, programs like Watt Time, and programs like Electricity Map to be able to provide designers and operators with the information that allows you to be able to optimize the load shape of your building to the load shape of your renewable generating assets.
Yeah, it's exciting.
So just one more thing about this is that USGBC and New Buildings Institute are partnered on the establishment of a much deeper dive metric into how we assess the grid responsiveness or grid citizenship of a building. So this initiative is called Grid Optimal. We're working on the development of it, and we are planning to deploy it in LEED as a standalone score for a project. Again, to recognize the fact that grid optimization is something that can be deployed in a traditional utility demand side management structure to be able to allow for buildings to be the assets to the grid operators that we know that they can be.
So let's pause there on operational carbon issues and go look again at embodied carbon in construction process. So we know, as we saw in the graph, that's really going to be extremely important in the next couple of decades for that massive new construction that's coming. So Lynn, you've had a lot of experience with LCA, and what can you share with us?
Yeah, well, first off, this is not, it's like preaching to the choir here. And if you look at the history of LEED, you can see whether it was certified wood or whether it's commissioning, that this rating system has helped advance those subjects and enabled developers and architects and clients to really embrace those issues and incorporate them in projects. And to me, it's really the sort of the golden nugget of LEED. There's two, but that is one, which is this ability to take an important issue within sustainability and advance it within our profession. And I believe that LCA has an opportunity to do that. Now, we're not there yet, but we have that opportunity. So what I want to just share with you are, these are just some of our projects, and I want to shout to Zoe McBride in my office, who's here today, who is one of our LCA experts, and show you that we're doing LCA on a wide variety of projects. They range, this list is just a short list, but they range from 40,000 square feet to 300,000 square feet. They range from nonprofit clients to for-profit developers. So it's not LCA is something that can be embraced by every one of our clients and every building and project type. The key is to raise the issue that it's important for something to do on a LEED project. And I think what I'm seeing in the market, and when I talk to clients, is that if the consultant or the engineer or the architect doesn't bring up that there's an opportunity to do an LCA on a project, then they're not going to know to do it. So I guess one of my actions to all of you would be to go back to your clients and say, guess what? We can do an LCA for you on this project. Now, how many of you are currently doing LCA on projects? Okay, so there's a good group here. Now, how many of you are, okay, so this is going to be kind of yes, raise your hand. Raise your hand if they're doing it because they're trying to achieve a certain level of certification, like get to gold. So that it's worth 3 points in the LEED rating system, and frankly, it's not a very expensive 3 points. So there's a few of you that they're doing it because they're trying to get to a certain level. How many of you are doing it because the client is interested in learning about how to make their building a better building? Okay, there's a few of you, so that's good. I mean, that's really where we want to go, but what we find at this point is that, frankly, I'm happy to have clients do it however they choose to do it because we're educating them about these issues, and I think that's important. So what I want to just mention a little bit is some of these projects are, for instance, when you're doing an LBC materials pedal, you're actually required to do an LCA, which is great. LEED obviously is still an option. It's going to be morphing, I'm hearing from Brendan, and maybe not the 4.1, but future versions of LEED. It'll be more integrated in the Optimized Energy Performance Credit. I think that's where we all want to be going. So the exciting thing is clients are starting to look at it, but you as the design team have to raise these issues. So in terms of some findings for us, just an office building, a residence hall, and a library, and you can see that concrete is the red, the steel is orange, glass is yellow, insulation is green, and the other is blue. And it just gives you an idea of different project types. I mean, it's no shock that concrete is the number one, highest percentage on most of these projects, except this library, because this client chose to use extruded polystyrene. So that had a great impact on our global warming potential. And so, again, if we have an opportunity to educate our clients, if you do an LCA early, you can make these decisions and change what you're putting in your specs. That's really the goal. The goal isn't just to check off the LEED box. The goal is to make changes to your building. So there are lots of benefits to doing an LCA. Of course, making these informed decisions about product and material selection, achieving LEED certification with the greatest cost value, and again, educating our leaders about these carbon-intensive materials. And I'm sure if you walk around the floor and you start asking some of the manufacturers questions, you should start asking them, how are you addressing, the issue of carbon? How are you reducing your material impact on climate change? We used to do this 15 years ago. We'd walk the floor and we'd say, how much recycled content is in your product? How much toxins are in your product? And it made a difference. You can see today how many incredible manufacturers there are and the work that they're doing to help make their products healthier and certainly better for the climate. So one of the things I'm encouraged by is you can see that concrete, as I said, is a big red number here. I know that one of the top 10 building products from Building Green this year is a product that uses post-consumer recycled bottled glass instead of fly ash as a low embodied carbon additive to concrete. How great is that? Fly ash is what we generally use. That's great. Reduce cement. That's fantastic. And now we're getting products out there that are now addressing the health aspect also. So I encourage you to check that product out and look at that list, because Building Green does a great job every year of finding the top 10 products. So in Thornton Tomasetti, we have been really an advocate in addressing embodied carbon, and we are our firm has looked at over 400 buildings to look at embodied carbon, and 50% of embodied carbon is from typical buildings from structural materials. And I see some friends out there and some of the other structural engineering firms, our friends and colleagues, and they do some really great work too in this area. And it's really important that we address our materials in our buildings, and the big materials, the steel, the concrete, because you can see that this 50% is quite high. So 6 years ago, Thornton Tomasetti has been documenting our embodied carbon in our structural projects. As I said, we've done about 400. And this was all started because we wanted to meet and try and achieve the 2030 commitment. I believe we were the first engineering firm to sign up for that. And the way to get there is, of course, as an engineering firm, a structural engineering firm, is to look at the way our buildings are being designed and built. We've been very active in the Carbon Leadership Forum, as some of you out there have been as well, and have led this new Structural Engineers 2050 commitment. And so the good news is that we have a strong community of structural engineers looking at these issues. So, but you can also see that TT has had a 39% reduction in our embodied carbon since we started this assessment. However, we've kind of, I would say we've plateaued a bit. And we are looking at that and trying to figure out how we move beyond our plateau and what can we do as a firm to get beyond that, because we don't want to plateau. We want to continue to make a difference and reduce that number. So, I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you some of this information, and it's important that we look at all aspects. And I think this is a slide that, Ted, I think, did you put this together? And so this is just showing how important it is to address, whole building carbon accounting at every level. And it's critical that we come together as a building industry to look at these different aspects, whether it's the building, whether it's the grid, whether it's transportation. What is it? It's not a single solution. And again, that's the beauty of this organization. That's my other golden nugget about USGBC is we're made up of a diverse group. Diversity is the key to achieving so many things in our life, whether it's diverse project types, whether it's diverse people, whether it's diverse ways we look at our projects and how we address reducing our impact on global climate change. And we have to look at all of these areas.
So picking up on that, and how we can better leverage LEED as a tool going forward, what are some of the opportunities to get more LEED projects using LCA, and more importantly, to use them to make decisions that will reduce their footprint? So again, maybe this is for the clients who do it to get points, to go from silver to gold. But as I said, it doesn't matter to me at this point because it's about the market transformation. We're trying to educate people. So we will be with clients and their mandate to have a certain goal, and they don't want to do, whether it's the water or energy, and we'll talk about doing water and energy. It's really, obviously the crux. We'll say, okay, we have an opportunity to do an LCA. Oh, what is that? And we'll explain what that is. So again, I think it's raising the issue and saying that it's an opportunity and a possibility. And then not just doing it internally in the firm, but then educating the client about why you're doing it and what impact that they can have and what changes they can make, hopefully early in the design process. It's not always easy because you're using Revit models, you're using drawings and specs and other information to glean how the impact, because again, embodied carbon is just one aspect of an LCA. It's much more complex than embodied carbon. Ben, do you have any comments from the owner perspective, how you're starting to think about that?
Yeah, so we're definitely thinking about it. I think we need to do a lot more educating on this topic. I think that there are methods of designing and building buildings that we've become comfortable with. We've made money. We've been successful. To alter that requires elevating the awareness and the importance of this issue. I think there's very little understanding across the industry about how much of the life cycle carbon is tied up in the materials. Right? We often overlook it. We think about electricity, gas, steam, and those are really what we're looking at. It's what we identify as the operating cost drivers, and it's easy to overlook embodied carbon. So we need to do more.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add anything, Ben?
Yeah, I think the slide that Liz had up there earlier that showed the transition from the carbon footprint of the building being all about the things that we made it out of, over time being dominated by energy is the reason that energy is the thing that we are focused on from a building's perspective. But from a new construction perspective, I think that talking to your clients about the fact that, over a 20-year time span, and this is a very important 20 years for based on the IPCC report and everything else we know about the way that carbon emissions are changing the climate, that over that 20-year time frame, the thing that there's a really strong case to be made that from a new construction perspective, you really got to nail the embodied energy, because that's going to be the carbon that's in the air over the next 20 years, right? And then we catch up with all the energy that we use on the back end of that 20 years. But if we miss a tipping point in that 20 years, it's kind of game over from a lot of the things that we've seen. So I think that's the other piece of this, is that the urgency around embodied on a new construction project is something that has been underrepresented because we've seen the 60-year horizon. We don't have a 60-year horizon anymore, and that's a big takeaway from a lot of the conversations that we've been having with CLF over the years that we've been talking to them, and is becoming increasingly something that we're trying to highlight with the way that we reward project teams for taking action in the rating system.
I think, Lynn, if you go back to that last slide with the whole building carbon accounting, Global Climate Action Summit was in San Francisco a few months back, and we sponsored a Carbon Smart Building Day. And we had different factions in the room, the operational carbon and then the embodied carbon folks. And one of my favorite people on the planet is Larry Strain, and we were having an argument about, embodied carbon versus operational. And I said, well, are you accounting for the refrigeration and the embodied carbon, or is that an operational thing? It was like, well, I never think about refrigerants and the global warming potential of refrigerants, especially when we're talking about electrification of buildings and using more refrigerant and, say, variable volume mechanical systems, is huge. And then we had a net zero water project that, we had brought black water reclamation systems on site, and that power and that carbon emissions on site was very thoughtful in that process, because you start to see that part of the emissions on, the water and the sewer grid that we're connected to. And we talk about the natural gas grid or the electrical grid. We're also connected in most of these buildings to our sewer systems. And then being able to think, okay, they're missing big chunks of the equation in our carbon accounting. And in that conversation with Larry that day, I was like, well, LEED is already measuring some of these things on water efficiency and refrigerants, and energy and LCA tool can do that. Can we start to bring all those elements in to do a whole building life cycle carbon analysis? And then I started to have that conversation with Brendan on some of our TAG conversations, and we're like, well, okay, yes, we can, but let's take the small bites, and we'll talk about that in the future. But I think we need to evolve as design engineers and architects and planners and owners to start thinking about all the building elements that are contributing to our global warming potential.
So do we see the points evolving, perhaps, to push more projects to LCA and using it in an impactful way?
I see that happening. It's it's obviously y'all's call, right? Because you're ultimately going to be the people who vote on this. But in terms of the way, from my perspective, the writing's on the wall, right? We're measuring greenhouse gas from an embodied perspective, or global warming potential from an embodied perspective. We're measuring greenhouse gas from an energy perspective. We're measuring greenhouse gas from a transportation perspective. We're measuring the greenhouse gas footprint of the water that we're using. The common currency across all these things is greenhouse gas, and our ability to put that all in one big bucket, one Uber credit.
Or Lyft.
Or Lyft, yeah. or fair enough. the lift credit. I'm fine. I'm probably going to get sued. But our ability to do that is becoming more and more real as the tools that Lynn uses for LCA become more readily available. As we start putting in hourly emissions profiles using a VERT or watt time or energy map, electricity map into our energy models, that ability to sort of put them all into one bucket and say, do a better job on this one thing is around the corner, right? It's an evolution of our thinking, but from a programmatic design perspective, which is a lot of the way that we have to look at this from a LEED perspective, the next best dollar from a carbon perspective might be a battery in Southern California. And if we're not putting all of that into one big metric, we might not have the ability to send that signal to the market and reward them for taking the best behavior. And I think that's ultimately, when you talk about the value of this, I hope that the projects end up being something that we can say that the carbon leadership that's demonstrated by a project that has an EUI of 28 and is also a million stories tall. Hopefully, that's something that resonates with the people who are in your spot.
Totally. So we're doing 3 megawatts of storage right now in
Right.
Colorado Center and Santa Monica, and I've had difficulty describing what that means, right? Because I like this grid citizenship concept, because it really is a grid resiliency play. There's very little savings. It's hard to pencil a battery storage system today, and we're really doing it to be a good citizen, to be responsible, and I think we also want to deliver one in Santa Monica where their incentives are strong, learn how the technology works, and then apply it in other areas of the country that really need it. We're also, on a couple projects, planning for storage as we do conceptual design development, particularly in garages, where I believe there's a huge opportunity in the future to use garages and repurpose garages for energy storage.
Cool. Yeah.
I wanted to mention a couple tools for those of you who are interested in LCA. So at Thornton Tomasetti, we generally use the one-click LCA tool. It's created by BioNova. We've also used the Athena Impact Estimator, which has been around a long time. We like the one-click LCA, this is what Zoe tells me, because our team has found it to be a very streamlined process. However, it's not a free service. So you have to be willing to invest a little money into it to use that. But the one is one-click and the other is the Athena, and there are others. I'm curious, I would love to hear from any of you what ones you're using to do the work on LCA. Are there others you'd like to recommend to the audience? Tally?
Tally.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, and Tally is the Revit plugin. You have to have a license for that as well, but a combination of the Tally and Athena is
Did you hear? So Tally and Revit, Tally and Athena combination, you have to pay for it. It's not a free service.
And there's a new tool that I think Skanska is working on. I'm not with Skanska, but that they are working on in Seattle, outside of Seattle, on a large project. That is the EL.
It's called EC3.
EC3 that Skanska is developing.
Yeah, get on them to release that. It's going to be cool. Yeah.
Any others? Okay, so which one?
Gabby.
Okay.
Gabby.
Yep, Gabby. All right.
So stepping back and looking again at sort of where the global building stock needs to go and how LEED fits in. I mean, we've changed a lot, but there's so much more to do, and now we are running out of time. So how do we reach more projects? We're a leadership standard, and we want to stay that way, but we need to engage more projects, more buildings, especially in those Asia markets that are really growing.
Require it. Make it a policy mandate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one way to get it done.
Spoken like a Californian.
Spoken like a Californian. It's driven, policy and mandate have driven sustainability in the state of California significantly.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Really good stuff.
Yeah.
If we had a duck curve in Indiana, it'd be a good problem to have.
So we want to open up to the audience for questions, so please make your way to the mic, and we'll just take some off. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dave Johnson from Sarah. I was inspired this morning by the leadership taking into account that we can't leave others behind. that we need to take care of the rest of the world that may not be able to afford these same luxuries and these same measures, is LEED, or do you have clients considering the social cost of carbon in these new moves, rather than just simply thinking about tons or cap and trade value? Are we considering the social cost of carbon?
It's for probably Ben and Lynn, as far as from an owner's perspective. So the social cost of carbon is a way to monetize your carbon impact and help that in decision making, right? So is that something you're doing yet?
I think, personally, I'm motivated by the social cost. The best tool I've seen for that was the co-benefits, or COBE calculator, that Dr. Joe Allen at the Harvard School of Public Health is working on, where they quantified what $1 invested in energy efficiency does for social health at the macro scale. I think that we're always looking for, we call them S indicators, social indicators, because the E of ESG, environmental social governance, is pretty well established at this point. So I do think there needs to be more S disclosures that are related to climate change, climate action, and greenhouse gas mitigation. We are looking at the COBE calculator, figuring out if that's a valid way to quantify the social impact of greenhouse gas mitigation. We haven't done so yet, but I think that is absolutely on the minds of many professionals and peers that I work with.
Well, and I was also really moved this morning by Amal's presentation on connecting human rights and climate change. And I think those of us in this room kind of understand that, although it was really emotional to hear her say it. And I think we need to hear more of it. And I think we need to share that information with our clients and our colleagues and the people we work with, because it's hard to make connections if you're working on a building and you're designing the bathrooms, or you're designing the structure, or you're picking the materials. That's the view you have and the lens you have. And I think that we could do a better job within our own worlds of raising that issue. And I think that's one of my actions to take back with me, is to help raise that issue with my colleagues, because I thought it was a very strong and profound way to present it.
And I'm not sure I would split hairs on the fact that the strategies that we're encouraging project teams to take that will reduce their greenhouse gas emissions there is a definite social outcome of those. But the other places that we're dealing with the social side, social impacts of the built environment, we have a credit that is rewarding a pilot credit that is rewarding project teams for using triple bottom line cost-based accounting as a metric to sort of understand those things. The other thing that I would say is that we have a social equity working group that has been really doing some excellent work trying to identify leverage points within project delivery and operational phases of buildings to understand how we can do better and start asking questions like, do you want to do an LCA, right? Because I think that's part of the thing that we can do a much better job around. And that group, that social equity working group, is really a fantastic resource. And I'm hoping that they sort of spread throughout the rest of the LEED stuff, so it's not just a little node. Then, yeah.
And one of my oldest clients is low-income housing, First Community Housing, and probably one of my first LEED certified projects. And they do LEED certification for health and equity. Reducing energy costs for their clients is critical, and they're looking at decarbonization strategies for health and wellness for low-income and senior housing, which is absolutely fantastic. They're doing great things.
All right.
It sounds like with the, I call it the energy or carbon credit, you want to do 87-60 matching.
Yes.
Is what you want to get to.
Yes.
When you do that, then, are you basically just saying the only renewables we want to use are hydro and biomass because they're the only thing that's going to give it to you? I mean, wind only works a third of the time, solar 18% of the time.
I think that when you look at the way that the load profile of a building matches the generation profile, I think that if we can bring up that Google mapping that they did, that visualization, I think the reality is, Bob, that when we look at that, what we're encouraging, so this, from a Google perspective, is a roadmap, right? They want to invest in renewables that are operating during the blacks, right? And that's the piece of this that they want, that they're saying this is the signal. And this, as a signal from a design perspective, gives you the ability to understand where to prioritize your next energy conservation measure or piece of distributed energy resource.
No, I understand that, but what I'm looking at is that LEED, you want to evolve to 8760 matching, I assume within the grid that the building is operated, right?
Well, there's some details that we're working
I mean, you
out,
don't want
but
to you don't want a Texas rec to offset a New York rec, right? Because it doesn't, work.
But I think it's a question of global emissions, though, so it's not necessarily. I think there's regional emissions factors that can be dealt with from a public health perspective that accrue at a local level, but I'm not.
Yeah.
We're challenged by some of those. It's not here, it doesn't count. Thinking.
Yeah. And I think we dealt with a little bit of those metric issues with we don't have an hourly signature from India yet to be able to utilize in that application. So as a static GHG emission for the country, the EIO, one of the organizations, IEA, thank you, has those metrics for the global metrics, but not on an hourly basis. So we need to have some flexibility in the metric.
Thanks so much. I get nervous even asking questions, so thanks for talking. One quick question for Lynn and one question for Brendan. For the information you provided, the material contribution breakdown, first of all, I'm Kim from SCS Global Services. We are an LCA practitioner firm. We also certify products like EPDs. And I sell these things, so it's really important and top of mind for me, decarbonization in particular. So this side, thanks. Did this just consider structure and enclosure, or also all interiors, like flooring that gets replaced over and over?
This is structure only.
Okay, great. I'm curious to see what that looks like, and maybe Larry Strain has more information for whole buildings on how, if you look at also interiors, how that shifts things. Second question, Brendan, 4.1. I heard from someone at one of the booths that was at, mentioned in 4.1 there be more credit recognition for decarbonization for product manufacturers for building materials. We already, of course, have EPDs. Is there anything specific that's coming out to incentivize product manufacturers to continue providing, or a larger group of manufacturers to provide data specifically for LCA-based data for carbon?
Without getting into specifics, I think the answer to the question is yes. But there are a bunch of specifics that are still. We've spent a lot of time working through the renewable sector, through the energy section of the rating system, and I think that decarbonization is front and center on that piece. There's parallel offers going on in materials section, and I don't know if we have time to get into everything that's going on, but I would encourage you to find us after so we can dig into it.
Thanks.
Hey, guys.
Hey, man.
Hi.
Good to see everybody. As some of you know, I've been involved in energy efficiency and conservation since the 70s, basically, and obviously early with LEED and so forth. And the frustration, we've made tremendous progress. All of the things you said are good and right, and we need to move going forward, but we're running out of runway. Okay, and some of this is just not going to occur fast enough, and the acceptance and adoption in the industry and in the marketplace is just not going to happen fast enough to make the changes we need to make. So it needs to be scale jump. There needs to be large-scale change. One of the things that I keep finding that we don't quite have is a metric on the business model or on the cost index, kind of like the LCA, which extends the cost of not doing anything. And there's been some reports. I know there's been some economists who have done reports of not doing anything about global warming, and it's 10 to 1, or it's an order of magnitude difference in terms of doing something in advance versus not doing it. But it seems, and I've had this conversation recently about resiliency, there needs to be a cost. It's because who pays for infrastructure upgrade? Okay, it's not sexy, it costs a lot of money, and you can't do it on a project-by-project basis. Somebody earlier said, if I have a data center over here and I want to use the free heat to heat a building over here, I can't get across the street because of utility regulations. Right. Okay, so, and there's a cost model. The more energy efficient you are, the utilities don't have an incentive to do that, right? It's their business. So there needs to be a totally different model, business model and cost model and metrics that allow us to account for the cost of not doing the things that need to be done in infrastructure and overall energy use in the marketplace. Some of it's being driven in the marketplace, and there's early adopters or good citizens. But and if we're really going to get there, it needs to be something where you really can measure that against, and it needs to be incorporated somehow.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Brendan. I'm going to say hi. Karen Jocelyn from the Ohio Senate fight.
Yes,
if you remember
that. I do remember. I wore
I'm-
a tie that day, everybody.
well, you had a suit on, I think. Yeah,
I know,
it was
right?
impressive.
A game. For Ohio.
Much appreciated.
Yeah.
But I'm in Portland, Oregon now, which is awesome. I'm with PAE Engineers, and we find this is kind of a narrower, more technical question, okay? We already do a lot of the other alternative things, and we're a newly just labeled firm, so we get another pilot credit
Right
for
on.
the social equity team thing.
Congratulations.
But when it comes to really looking at the renewables on-site controlled, let's say for a project as big as the Portland Airport, because of the islanding on purpose of the grid for resilience purposes in certain parts of the country, the ability to net meter and sell back is you have to get in line to get a slot to sell it back to, and you have to guarantee and all that. Is that factoring into any of this combination, carbon, energy fuel source factor, any of these things that you're trying to put together, the fact that the grids are going to an islanding situation on purpose?
I think no. I'll point to this button right here. It's all about the rates. Because, I live in Virginia, right, outside of D.C., and Dominion has the exact same thing. They are our overlords in that sense. And they have a net metering prohibition as well that prohibits us from exporting back. So I think that the short answer is no, because we don't necessarily know how to exert that leverage point through a building project. But I would point you to a sister rating system called PEER, which is essentially LEED for power, that allows you to be able to account for those things, get credit for those things, and we're working to bridge the peer-lead relationship, and a lot of the grid optimal stuff does that for us, to be able to say, if you're a peer-certified microgrid or nanogrid or whatever it is, and you're building a LEED building, that's a 1 + 1 = 3 type of thing, right? So that combination is on the rise as well.
Okay. And the regional islanding by the utilities isn't going to hurt us necessarily in just a straightforward LEED project?
Well, I mean, in reality, the thing that we care about in that metric is carbon. So the answer to the question largely depends on what your generation mix is, right? Is that right?
Well, it's Oregon,
Absolutely.
so it's terrible. Yeah. We're not Seattle.
Yeah.
Well, it's okay. I just didn't know if the fact that
Better
it's
than Ohio,
smaller grid sections, if the way the utility is setting things up, if that will hurt us in any of the factors. Because I don't know.
I would say it will only help us, and even some of our utilities are looking at microgrid applications that gives them more resiliency.
Okay. Right.
We're talking about some of the fires in California right now, and we don't have resiliency because of the high transportation lines. So we're looking at microgrid applications to really get rid of some of those big distribution lines that are causing some of the issues.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for raising it. That's something to think about.
I mean, I could go on for an hour about the issues we've had with utilities and installing renewable energy.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yep.
Do you want to go on for an hour? We should get a beer
Another
and do
session,
that.
yeah.
We should get a beer and do that.
I work with a lot of them, and it's never easy, and we've often had to downsize renewables on site or curtail generation to avoid export.
Yeah.
Especially in older cities, spot networks. Having to add a recloser will kill an energy storage project. There's a number of issues we run into with on-site renewables and utility interconnection.
Well, how much has your relationship changed with your different utilities now in the last 3 years with those discussions?
I think it's gotten worse, frankly.
Oh, wow.
Because now there are better incentives and there's longer queues of projects, and you still have the same number of people within the utilities working on, DG interconnection. So there's less bandwidth, I think, with the utilities and the individuals who are just literally overwhelmed with applications and a lot of ISOs.
Technical question on multiple metrics. So in California, we have this great metric called TDV. And I see you smiling. It's got everything: carbon, location, time of use, seasonal changes, climate changes. Is that equivalent to the mixed metric we're talking about today? And if not, how is it different?
I've been trying to explain TDV since the inception in 2005 to my architectural partners. It's a challenging metric for the design community because it's getting less and less meaningful for building performance. It's a grid performance application. One thing that came out, which is similar to a carbon metric, is the time-dependent source application that Architecture 2030 is in the Zero Code. I would take a look at that because that gives a source metric based on the type. It kind of matches the carbon signature. TDV doesn't really match up with carbon emissions on the Cal ISO specifically. Because there are other things in the time-dependent valuation that are accounted for that skew that metric.
Like grid congestion.
I have a 3-hour lecture on TDV. If you want to do that this evening, I can do it for you. But yeah, it's a challenging metric, and it's not equal to, I would say, time-dependent source or a carbon metric in our grid structures.
Okay. How are we doing?
59 right now.
Okay. Yeah,
One last one.
It is, yeah.
Yes, it is.
Aloha from Hawaii.
Hi.
I'm the sustainability coordinator for our state government, and we recently passed a law to develop and establish a carbon offset program locally. Concurrently, we have a 100% RPS. So the goal of this carbon offset program is really to look for alternatives besides the renewable, since you may have an additionality problem for us. So the focus of that law was really on water sustainability, and my question is, in terms of the LEED strategy in the built environment, looking for alternative carbon offset projects for our future, could we pursue any type of water infrastructure through the water efficiencies in the LEED certification process as a carbon offset project?
I really like that idea.
Yeah.
I really like that idea. It would be a fascinating thing to explore because, like I said, the metric that we're gravitating towards is GHG, the currency that's going to make these things interchangeable. I really like that idea. It would be great to connect after and chat about it.
I think, too, the waste...
Corey Enk is in the back, everybody.
Yeah.
We can drag him, too, because he definitely will be interested.
I would say, wastewater and waste are very big categories for a carbon footprint.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Yes.
You could look at what your cities are doing for their greenhouse gas emission inventories and how they've accounted for those categories, and that might be a way to look at some ways to leverage LEED as an incentive structure. Or something.
Yeah, we are looking for the wastewater and the landfills and our waste to energy production facility, but we're actually undergoing the inventory right now. It should be released by the end of the year. So thank you for that. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for the idea.
Thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel, and thank you for participating.